Hey, what's up there? Silas here. Some of you may have heard the statement, the West is the best. Now, I don't disagree with the sentiment there, but I think something more accurate to say would be the West is the current result of the best way humans have figured out how to build a society. I'm trying to work it out during an actual thing, and towards the end there, I kind of normally change them around. It's a thought that just came to me a few weeks back, maybe. Now, I've been trying to think of what are the key aspects of the West. I was born in France, moved to Kenya, then moved to the United States of America, lived in Italy, now I'm back in Nairobi, been back and forth to the United States of America. So all those places are westernized. And Kenya was a colony of the British, so it's rather westernized, especially living in Nairobi in the areas that I'm in. But in those different cultures and different communities, I've seen certain aspects of the West involved with other historical traditions, other kind of people, other kind of mindsets and things like that. Traveled around different parts of the United States of America, lived in San Francisco, New York City, Washington, D.C. area, went to school in the West Virginia, Ohio Panhandle area, known some friends in different areas and things like this, and also in other countries. And I'm trying to think of what is the term that's different between not necessarily West and the East. I haven't gone to Asia yet. I'm interested. I've been taking a lot of content in from manga and anime and things like that. I'm a Japanophile when it comes to entertainment and things like that, and try to learn the different stories that they tell themselves, different histories, different belief systems. What makes these cultures different? What makes these cultures different? What aspects of these cultures or these social constructs can come and be brought into this culture and be adopted, and why do some things not necessarily work in these places? And there's people talking about that maybe the West is collapsing right now, primarily the United States of America. And I'm not quite sure. And I think people assume, some people just assume that the United States of America has always been there. They seem to assume that and assume it will always exist. You see things in the future of stories set much forward in the future, like hundreds and thousands of years, people are traveling to different planets and things like that. Yet on Earth, there's still the United States of America, there's still China, there's still Russia and all the things like that. I'm like, I don't think that's going to happen. So I'm more interested in what's coming next. We are in a time when I think there's a zeitgeist shift. So I don't know what's going to be next. I don't know what are the key parts that help the West become the best way that humanity has created a civilization. Because I do think it is the best from what I know. Now there's other comparative things in other cultures that you can take from those cultures and say, okay, those parts are good, let's take them in. There's certain bad things about the West that were in there, say, okay, let's leave that out. So now that we're moving forward, globalization is here. We're living in a global society now. If you listen to this, you are a part of the global society. And I don't think we're going back into the past, short of some sort of solar flare or asteroid, some massive kind of destruction to the technology that we have, some disease or something like that. We are going to keep going forward to this globalized world. And what is the social structure going to be? There is not going to be a West anymore. There's not going to be an East anymore. It's just going to be the Earth. So how are humans going to be living on the Earth? And I think to do that, part of what I'm doing, part of what I'm interested in is looking at parts of the West and actually seeing, okay, which are the parts that are unique, that are different from other places, that I think are worthwhile to carry on to this next system. If other countries want to achieve certain things like the West did, how do we have those countries come forward, and other cultures and locations and societies come forward to match the positive things that they see in the West without having to go through many of the negative things that the West went through as they were learning and embracing some of these things? Because the conditions are changing, but the human beings are still the same, and the things that help us flourish are still relatively the same, because we're still on this planet. We're heading to Mars, going to the moon and things like this. We're about to be Solarians, but before we get to Solarians, how do we become Earthlings and live in a successful society? So to that end, with this preamble, I think this will be the start of a series of sorts where I'm going to be reading things specifically about the West, trying to understand things about specific nature of the West. Let me know what you think about the West specifically. And to begin, I'm going to go with Ludwig von Mises, who's somebody who's inspired me a lot. The Mises Institute has this on their website. And let me double check what it's actually called. It's called How Liberty Defined the West, and this is excerpted from Money, Market and Method, I think, by Ludwig von Mises. It's a group of essays that were put together after he passed away by his wife. This is back in 1973. And I am of the contention that problems occur not because of what X is, but because of how we define X. So I think if we want to avoid some of the problems of the West and carry on the positive things from the West that did make the West the best way that humans have figured out how to live civilization, I think it's good to define what that West actually was. And then once we have those things, we can see how we can go forward with some of these things, how we can teach other people who want to have the positive things of the West, as I mentioned before. And this will just be a straight reading of it. And then I think I'll have I read it already. I already recorded it. I read it through, then gave some thoughts and things after it. And that's it for now. Getting into it. Hello, 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 hello. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so this will be a reading from the Mises Institute, and this is How Liberty Defined Western Civilization. And as I mentioned at the start, I think there is something very unique about the West, and most of you are probably hearing this from the West, from somewhere that is in actually the West, or somewhere that has been westernized. Because when you talk about the Western world, it's like Western Europe, then they talk about United States of America, then they also say Australia, but Australia is in Asia and things like that. And then which parts of the African continent are considered westernized, or do they Africanized? Now, if you talk to a place like Hong Kong, if you talk about a place like Hong Kong, does that count as something that's westernized, or is that easternized, orientalized? So I think there should be a better term to define that as I'm trying to work my way through. But part of part of why I'm reading this is because I see certain aspects of the West that are being challenged, that are being lost, certain positive aspects. And is that saying the West is the best? And I would prefer to use, I'm going to start using, I'm offering this out there and I'm open to hear your opinion on whether this is more accurate or anything. The West is the current result of the best ways humans have figured out how to deal with the current reality that we find ourselves in. Because there was advancement of human flourishing before the idea of what the West is now, whatever idea you want to define that as, and there will be after. And what I'm wondering now is, are we getting to a point where we have to return certain Western values or enshrine certain Western values? Or do we need to start focusing on what are we going to build after? Because this human organism is going to continue evolving. And the circumstances, the environment that created the West no longer exists. So we're living in a different kind of world right now. So to that end of people wondering what is positive about the West, what made the West the West, how can we maintain the West being the West, people have offered other things that we need to bring back, strengthen and things like that, and I'm also one of those people looking around at this. And the Mises Institute has been a place where I found a lot of excellent information, and Ludwig von Mises, of which the Mises Institute is named after, has written a lot on the West, on the Western nature. And I think Mises is one of those very positive things that has come out from. There's no definition of I would have about the West that would not include it being a source and a cause and a reason for someone like Ludwig von Mises to have existed. So when I found this, I thought, okay, this is going to be interesting. Let's read something about what Ludwig von Mises thought about Western civilization here. Now, this is from Mises.org. There will be a link below to this or wherever you're listening to this. How Liberty Defined Western Civilization by Ludwig von Mises. And this was posted on March 2017 on the Mises Institute website. The history of civilization is a record of a ceaseless struggle for liberty. Social cooperation under the division of labor is the ultimate and sole source of man's success in his struggle for survival and his endeavors to improve as much as possible the material conditions of his well-being. But as human nature is, society cannot exist if there is no provision for preventing unruly people from actions incompatible with community life. In order to preserve peaceful cooperation, one must be ready to resort to violent suppression of those disturbing the peace. Society cannot do without a social apparatus of coercion and compulsion, i.e., without state and government. Then a further problem emerges: to restrain the men who are in charge of the governmental functions, lest they abuse their power and convert all other people into virtual slaves. The aim for all struggles for liberty is to keep in bounds the armed defenders of peace, the governors, and their constables. Freedom always means freedom from arbitrary actions on the part of the police power. The idea of liberty is, and always has been, peculiar to the West. What separates East and West is, first of all, the fact that the peoples of the East never conceived the idea of liberty. The imperishable glory of the ancient Greeks was that they were the first to grasp the meaning and significance of institutions warranting liberty. Recent historical research has traced back to Oriental sources the origin of some of the scientific achievements previously credited to the Hellenes. But nobody has ever contested that the idea of liberty was created in the cities of ancient Greece. The writings of Greek philosophers and historians transmitted it to the Romans and later to modern Europe and America. It became the essential concern of all Western plans for the establishment of the good society. It begot the laissez-faire philosophy to which mankind owes all the unprecedented achievements of the age of capitalism. The meaning of all modern political and judicial institutions is to safeguard the individual's freedom against the encroachments on the part of the government. Representative government and the rule of law, the independence of courts and tribunals from interference on the part of administrative agencies, habeas corpus, judicial examinations and redress of acts of the administration, freedom of speech and the press, separation of state and church, and many other institutions aimed at one end only, to restrain the discretion of the office holders and to render the individuals free from their arbitrariness. The age of capitalism has abolished all vestiges of slavery and serfdom. It has put an end to the cruel punishments and has reduced the penalty for crimes to the minimum indispensable for discouraging offenders. It has done away with torture and other objectionable methods of dealing with suspects and lawbreakers. It has repealed all privileges and promulgated equality of all men under the law. It has transformed the subjects of tyranny into free citizens. The material improvements were the fruit of these reforms and innovations in the conduct of government affairs. As all privileges disappeared and everybody was granted the right to challenge the vested interests of all other people, a free hand was given to those who had the ingenuity to develop all the new industries which today render the material conditions of people more satisfactory. Population figures multiplied, and yet the increased population could enjoy a better life than their ancestors. Also in the countries of Western civilization, they have always been the advocates of tyranny. The absolute arbitrary rule of an autocrat or an aristocracy on one hand, and the subjection of all other people on the other hand. But in the Age of Enlightenment, the voices of these opponents became thinner and thinner. The cause of liberty prevailed. In the first part of the 19th century, the victorious advance of the principle of freedom seemed to be irresistible. The most eminent philosophers and historians got the conviction that historical evolution tends towards the establishment of institutions warranting freedom, and that no intrigues and machinations on the part of the champions could stop the trend towards liberalism. In dealing with the liberty issue, one does not refer to the essential economic problem of the antagonism between capitalism and socialism. One rather points out that Western man, as different from Asiatics, is entirely a being adjusted to life in freedom and formed by life in freedom. The civilizations of China, Japan, India, and the Mohammedan countries of the Near East as they existed before these nations became acquainted with Western ways of life certainly cannot be dismissed as barbarism. These peoples, already many hundreds, even thousands of years ago, brought about marvelous achievements in the industrial arts, in architecture, in literature and philosophy, and in the development of educational institutions. They founded and organized powerful empires. But then their effort was arrested. Their cultures became numb and torpid, and they lost the ability to cope successfully with economic problems. Their intellectual and artistic genius withered away. Their artists and authors bluntly copied traditional patterns. Their theologians, philosophers, and lawyers indulge in unvarying exegesis of old works. Their monuments erected by their ancestors crumbled, their empires disintegrated, their citizens lost vigor and energy and became apathetic in the face of progressing decay and impoverishment. The ancient works of Oriental philosophy and poetry can compare with the most valuable works of the West. But for many centuries, the East had not generated any book of importance. The intellectual and literary history of modern ages hardly records any name of an Oriental author. The East has no longer contributed anything to the intellectual effort of mankind. The problems and controversies that agitated the West remained unknown to the East. In Europe, there was commotion. In the East, there was stagnation, indolence, and indifference. The reason is obvious. The East lacked the primordial thing, the idea of freedom from the state. The East never raised the banner of freedom. It never tried to stress the rights of the individual against the power of the rulers. It never called into question the arbitrariness of the despots. And, first of all, it never established the legal framework that would protect the private citizen's wealth against confiscation on the parts of the tyrants. On the contrary, deluded by the idea that the wealth of the rich is the cause of the poverty of the poor, all people approved of the practice of the governors of expropriating successful businessmen. Thus, big-scale capital accumulation was prevented, and the nations had to miss all those improvements that require considerable investment of capital. No bourgeoisie could develop, and consequently, there was no public to encourage and to patronize authors, artists, and inventors. To the sons of people, all roads towards personal distinction were closed but one. They could try to make their way in serving the princes. Western society was a community of individuals who could compete for the highest prizes. Eastern society was an agglomeration of subjects entirely depending on the good graces of the sovereigns. The alert youth of the West looks upon the world as a field of action in which he can win fame, eminence, honors, and wealth. Nothing appears too difficult for his ambition. The meek progeny of Eastern parents know of nothing else than to follow the routine of their environment. The noble self-reliance of the Western man found triumphant expression in such dithyrambs as Sophocles' choric Antigone hymn upon man and his enterprising effort, and Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Nothing of the kind has ever been heard in the Orient. Is it possible that the scions of the builders of the white man's civilization should renounce their freedom and voluntarily surrender to the suzerainty of omnipotent government? That they should seek contentment in a system in which their only task will be to serve as cogs in a vast machine designed and operated by an almighty plan maker? Should the mentality of the arrested civilizations sweep the ideals of the ascendancy of which thousands and thousands have sacrificed their lives? Ruere in servitum, they plunged into slavery, Tacitus sadly observed in speaking of the Romans in the age of Tiberius. And that's the end. This is excerpted from Money, Method, and the Market Process. And as mentioned, the author was Ludwig von Mises. So now I'll go back in and give you some thoughts of what I was thinking of as I was reading this, paragraph by paragraph. I think most of the paragraphs was, oh, what's this? What's this now? And before I get to that, there's two things I'd like to suggest you can also check out. The first being a conversation series my friend Stephen and I had, where he read Herbert Marcuse's essay on liberation and took out some excerpts and we discussed them and gave our thoughts on it. And one of the things that came out as I was reading this from Mises was the same thing that's come out when I read things from Marcuse and other thinkers that I consider to be rather great thinkers going into certain things. I'm wondering, what would their observations be if they had the access to knowledge that we had now? Not just coming to now and seeing, okay, what do you think has happened from the time that you were in there? But let's say we had the ability to share information that we have today and we transpose that back to when Mises was writing this. Because the essay on liberation was written in 1969 and Money, Method, and Market Process was essays by Ludwig von Mises that were put together after his death by his wife, Margaret von Mises. So this was put together after 1973. So they were writing around the same time, but they have rather different worldviews. Their definition of what liberty is rather disparate, is rather different on different sides. It might be the same if they actually sat down and had a conversation, and that's something that's also happened. I understand the way I think and speak sometimes can seem insufferable to certain people, but often when they take the chance, and I appreciate the people that do, and the friends that do speak in this manner, and like conversing in this manner, when we take the time to actually start discussing certain things, we start realizing that we might agree on general concepts, but just define them in different ways. Different things happen for the same reasons, the same things happen for different reasons. And the problem in the world is not because of what X is, but because of how we define X. So we're both trying to achieve X, but we think X, we say, okay, so we're both trying to achieve X, and then we say, okay, so to achieve X, let's do Y. But we don't agree on what Y means, or I think by Y they mean something else. So when we actually try to achieve that thing, there's some disagreement and there's some messing up, and that's how that's how the problems come to not achieving the X. Doesn't mean X isn't desirable by both of us, but that's, I think, part of why these problems exist. So while discussing Marcuse's essay on liberation, and previously having read his Repressive Tolerance, kind of smaller essay, was part of a 3-part thing. It was like in the end of something. But yeah, there's also listening to that. Maybe that's a third thing you can also check out. But while reading that, and also hearing this, reading this idea on liberty is Western, this excerpt from Money, Method, and Market Process by Ludwig von Mises, he's mentioning certain things about Asia and certain other places, and I'm wondering, do we have an accurate amount of information about those places? And maybe if he had more information about those places, he might change some of these things. There could be some things lost in translation. There's certain things that might be accurate and might not be, and I thought that was kind of something. And now, speaking of translation or getting documents and trying to understand it in a different way, the other thing I'd like to suggest is something that I posted on at least my YouTube. I'm going to get a personal website so I can get most of these links in one location. I do have a blog. I think there's also, I might leave a link to the blog post of it. I took the Declaration of Independence and rewrote it as the Declaration of Your Dependence. Because there's certain things I've been observing in the West that seems to go along with what some people are fearing, that the West is crumbling, that there's some things being lost in it. The growth of the state from supposedly being something that was supposed to leave the older structures of states, and now it's grown into the biggest state that has ever existed in the world, and I know it's a rather massive country, and there's certain considerations to have in it. But from the Constitution, that freedom and liberty, is there still freedom and liberty in that sense in the United States of America? And in the Western world. In the Western world, there's some differences with that, because the Western world, as we talked about when you go into Europe and things like that, they've been more socialist, they've been more communist, there's been other aspects in there. But part of the United States of America was ostensibly leaving that system of the monarchs and the theocracy in that kind of sense for some new sense of liberty and some new experiment on how to organize a society. So I was wondering, with that and with the Declaration of Your Dependence, I just took the Declaration of Independence, which I think is a magnificent document, and went in and actually just rewrote that as something that I thought was more matching to what's going on in current society. Now, with that in mind, it doesn't mean that if the positive things that made up the West are no longer there present in most of the people in the West, doesn't mean we can't continue those things. Was it ever something that was most of the people? No. As mentioned, part of the reason the West began, part of the reason the United States of America began, part of the reason they had the Declaration of Independence was because that was not the default way that people have behaved. This idea of liberty is something that is rather unique. It's not something that's there in the theologies. It's not something that's there in the East. It's not something that's there in other aspects of human society, human knowledge, it's a rather new human construct, and I think that is a particular thing. So now I'll go in and kind of do like a little breakdown of the different paragraphs and things, and just give my thoughts on the things that were written here. Okay, the first couple of paragraphs, the first paragraph is like one sentence. The history of civilization is a record of ceaseless struggle for liberty. I agree with that. I think that has been something that we may not have identified it as liberty as that time being, because of the term liberty and that idea, or even having the conditions to actually pursue liberty was different before we got to a point where we had advanced enough technologically to kind of separate ourselves from just the basic needs, the basic day-to-day of just maintaining life. Because nature itself doesn't care. Nature itself just keeps going. So to get to a point where we had those extra times to actually think, like, can we improve our quality of life and not just maintain life? That's something that developed to a situation where in certain places we've gotten to the point where we can consider liberty. And it says here, freedom always means freedom from arbitrary action on the part of the police power. Now, I think that is a key part, because when people speak about libertarians and anarchists, they often misconstrue what is being meant. It's not chaos. I value laws. I value policing. I value security. I value safety. I just don't think that in the current system with the states, where they have that monopoly of violence over a given area, those are the best kind of people to be in charge of really securing an area. Now, with all that said, in the United States of America, there are issues with that, but there's about 1,100 on average over the last 10 years, I think, in the United States of America, of people who were shot by police. Now, this is counting people who shot at the police first. This is counting people who have run at them with knives and other weapons. There definitely has been an issue with policing in the United States of America and other places in the West. But still, if you actually compared it to other places, most people would prefer what's happening in the West. Does that mean that's the best that can happen? No, it's the best current situation. We can do better, and I think we will do better. But the current reality of the world is we can't just say, let's have no policing at all, because there are people that are taking advantage of the situation as is with the system of policing by either entering that system and controlling it and using it to subjugate people, or just not really caring about the laws. So even if you took away that small stopgap that the policing system through the state actually provides now, it would be even worse. That is my estimation of what would happen in that situation. And I've also seen certain locations where there is less of a structure of policing, and it's not directly the policing, but it's also the people in it. So that's what I'm trying to think about. What is the key part that makes the policing in the West different from the policing here in Nairobi, Kenya, different from the policing in China, different from the policing in different places in the world? What is the unique part about it? And I think a key part of that is liberty and the justification and protection of private property and the valuation of individual rights and their general right, granted right to be free and not be violated. Non-aggression principle coming from things like that. Okay. Next paragraph. This is when he's talking about how the West is unique when it comes to liberty because that comes from the Greeks. Now, this is the thing, the Eastern Europe is different from the West. Is Eastern Europe considered part of the West, even if it's in Europe? Where exactly does it go? Is Turkey, is that kind of right next to Ottoman Empire? Is that considered part of what was in there? But when it comes down to this is now with the research. There might be more research now showing that there was some tradition of liberty. But when they're talking about liberty here, if you thought of liberty in some small village in China somewhere, and you had your own ability to have concepts of non-aggression principle and libertarian utopia, your own Galt's Gulch in this one location that happened in a few generations and then the people died off and it never spread, then some of those things do happen. Some inventions do occur that are not picked up by the rest of society. And when it comes down to history, we kind of deal with what we actually can see. And now, with this globalized world, globalization is already here, what truly is the difference between East-West, Oriental versus Occidental? What is the actual difference of that? Now, what is Western history versus Eastern history? Now, the same things that were learned from the West can still be taken up by people in the East. I've seen China has had some advancements in just the quality of life and some improvements in the quality of life of the people by adopting some of those ideas from the West, from the Greeks, of liberty and things like that. They still have their own traditions and their own culture and their own history that's still involved in there, but you can also do things that can be exchanged. Now I think it's human history. So just the same way how the Greeks had this, other people in Europe in the West at that time didn't have it, but they adopted it, and then 100 years later, now they were all using it. And then you go further, it wasn't there in the Americas because there were civilizations here that had their own concepts of society, and then they came here and they brought that. Here I'm living in Nairobi, Kenya. It was colonized by the British about 50 years ago, a little over 50 years ago. There was different kind of organizations that they had to exist back then that did not include liberty in the sense that I consider to be much more positive with this individualism, things like that. But here I am in Nairobi, Kenya, recording this with a valuation of this actual concept. So it's something that humanity can adopt because I think it's a human creation and we're already heading to Mars. And I think once we become Solarians, it's not going to be like, oh, no, that's a Western Earth thing, this idea of liberty, we don't have it here. They could be different different considerations and conditions in the environment that exists right then at that time. We might have invented a new form of actually civilization or a new social construct to kind of live around by that time. But those are the things that could change. But I think these things can be adopted. So we don't necessarily have to stick and say, great, that's Asian, that's Occidental, that's Western, that's Eastern anymore. We can just say that's human, and let's see the best ways to actually continue this whole human flourishing experiment thing that we have going on. So he ended that paragraph with talking about the unprecedented achievements of the age of capitalism. Now, depending on how you define capitalism, you might disagree with this. I think he's going more with the Rothbardian definition of capitalism. They also had a separate video. I was talking about that, reading an article about how Murray Rothbard came in, and he kind of adjusted what the original definition of capitalism was when the word started coming into general usage, that is closer to what I think democratic socialists in the United States of America and socialists in the West in general kind of use the term to be, where it's not just free market capitalism, where it's just focusing on the main finances, the main means of production being in private hands. The fact that you already don't have the monetary system being in private hands, that is already a state institution in most places, that already limits how capitalistic a system can actually be. So leaving that aside, it discusses certain aspects of representative government, habeas corpus, judicial examination and redress of acts of the administration, freedom of speech and the press, separation of state and church, and other institutions that I think are rather central to things that I would consider to be Western in civilization-wise, that are rather unique and different. They've been developed in other places, but the other places seem to have their own little aspects of it. Some places don't even have some of these things in it. Like you'll see some constitutions of many countries don't have something like the freedom of speech and the press. And I think a key thing of the freedom of speech was not necessarily just the press, because even when these things were created, in the Declaration of Independence and things like that in the Constitution, the access to actually a printing press was rather limited. Freedom of speech was closer. The freedom of press was closer to just anyone could have the speech, the right to go and speak out and say something, make yourself heard without having to be limited. And now we talk about that. Is that something that's increasing in society or reducing? Is it becoming more concentrated in a few hands? And are we getting to a point where we need to figure out how to spread that back out in the general Western experiment that was going on? I think that's something interesting to kind of think of. But again, when he ends off here and he says that the purpose of all of this was to restrain the discretion of the office holders and render the individuals free from their arbitrariness. That's a key thing, because I think there are some arbitrary laws and like what is whiteness? For example, what does whiteness mean? What does infrastructure mean? What does racism mean? What does sexism mean? What is the wage gap? What are certain things? What does gender mean? What are certain things that the governments in the West, specifically in the United States of America, seems to be saying are important things that the government is responsible for? It's rather arbitrary. One is something, this thing, and then all of a sudden, because this other person does a rather similar thing, it's not that thing anymore. And I think that gets kind of arbitrary. And how much is that involved in the systems? How many regulations, how many laws, how many rules are actually arbitrary, and how many of them actually do things? When they talk about these common sense laws that come after something has happened, how often would those laws being proposed and policies being proposed, how often if you took those policies, those laws, and you said, okay, this happened on this date, if these were actually accepted, if this was actually part of the law before that date, this thing wouldn't have happened. And I can't really think of too many times, if any, that happened, especially when it has major issues. Like, okay, you're banning that. Well, that person didn't even use that in order to do that. Oh, we need to add this law and check for this person to obtain that. Well, that person obtained it entirely legally in an entirely different system that's not even addressed by these added laws you're adding for this kind of thing. So those are the kind of arbitrary nature that I kind of see being done with things. And in part, I think this arbitrariness is because the Western experiment has been so successful that people have very little of substance to actually require. Now it's coming to just smaller things like, oh, I want my eyelashes curled in a certain way. It's like, no, I need them curled to like maybe 230 degrees curl or something like that. Somebody else is like, that's only like 170. No, I want them a little more curled. It seems like some of the things people are complaining about are to those levels. Now the next paragraph, the age of capitalism has abolished the vestige of slavery and serfdom. So some people say we're enslaved to that, and I have a separate video about that. Is modern slavery, like people say, oh, debt slavery and things like that. That is different from chattel slavery. Now, personally, just make a list, think about in your mind, what are the countries with the most freedoms, best quality of life that you can think of? Or think of the most free places, the places you'd want to live the most, the kind of quality of life that you'd want. And chances are most of those places in the West. You might think of a few in Japan and things like that, but that's when I was asking, is Japan westernized? How much has Japan changed from when Mises was actually writing this and knowing about Japan? How Japanese was Japan at that time versus it being now? And then something like with a racism type of situation with minorities, how welcome, if you are a minority in that area, would you feel in Japan versus in one of the countries in the West? What kind of quality of life would you want to live? Would you be able to actually be part of the society, feel like you're part of it? Even if they treat you, they harm you, they don't, do you feel like you're part of it? Because there's other parts of extra society where you feel like you're part of this, we're social animals. Do you feel you can have that in that place? And I think most of those places are in the West. I think most of those places would be more capitalist by whatever definition of capitalism you have than other places that are more socialist, communist. So that's just something to have in mind, where I think that that is kind of true, that it has abolished many of the vestiges of slavery and serfdom, and this quality of life has increased for people. And that kind of goes into this next paragraph where he's talking about the population figures have multiplied. And yes, there has been an increase in population, an exponential increase in population, but I think we are going to level out at about 10 million. I think 10 to 11 million might be how we level out, or might even reduce lower than that, because we're getting to a point right now where places in Africa, major parts of Asia are getting more technologically advanced, and there's not that much of going into that biological need of just continuing to reproduce and have as many kids as possible. It's now becoming actually more expensive to have more kids, because the few kids that you have, you invest more energy into raising those kids. There's a high chance those kids will actually grow to adulthood. There's other social structures that are going to involve into being able to support you in your older life. So you just look at places that become more westernized, more civilized, and the number of kids being born per couple kind of drops. So we're not going to have a situation where it's just going to be an infinite, like a continued growth. You're going to actually level out because the conditions that led to other places having more kids are going to change. I think you're also going to have a more realistic monetary system, so a lot of people aren't having kids and debts, and there's going to be a more accurate estimation of the value of having X number of kids or any kids versus this kind of situation. I think that's going to level out. But I think in part, you can't really argue against saying that if you listen to this, chances are you are living a better in general quality of life than you would be if you were still living in that area back when Mises was writing this, let alone 100 years ago, 500 years ago, thousands of years ago. Those things definitely have changed. Now, next paragraph, he talks about how they actually have been advocates for tyranny and absolute and arbitrary rule of the autocrat or the aristocracy, or on the other hand, the subjugation of all people on the other hand. That's what he says here. Okay, on one hand and then on the other hand. Now, this is one thing that I've thought of before. Socialism and communism were also invented in the West. Realistically, these were invented in the West. When you talk about the thing with Turkey and things before, there's some situations where it might have been the Ottoman Empire, some of the things coming in it. And I should do a separate presentation or reading about that actual initiation of it. People start saying, okay, it's Christianity that came here. I'm like, no, Christianity has been in other places in general, and it hasn't had the effect that it did coming through the West. The Christianity was westernized, and the current Christianity that exists in places in the West is a westernized form of Christianity, which was a Middle Eastern ideology, Middle Eastern way of looking at the world. So I'm not saying the collectivist way of living that's taught by socialism and communism, which you can see has been adopted in other places in the world, was unique. It's uniquely something where only the Western human was the one that could do this. But no, they actually got to the point, like I mentioned before, sometimes somebody comes up with something and it doesn't catch on to the point, and then that's not where we say that's the origin, even though it might have come from somewhere else. Like even in this, I think later on they talk about how there are certain concepts where like, oh no, we think that started in the West, and you find out it's actually tracked somewhere. Or, oh, we think we had this, like the concept of zero, that was actually something that was developed in South America before the Europeans were, but the Europeans were able to still travel around, circumnavigate the globe in a sense without the concept of zero. Then they adopted that. Now, like the concept of zero, do you want to say the concept of zero is uniquely South American, uniquely New Worldian, or is it something that you do consider to be part of humanity? Would you consider it part of the West because the West are the ones that spread it around the world? You see, those are the kind of things that I'm saying. Let's just look about this as human nature, look different ways of humans doing different things. But back to this paragraph. There have been people who have not been that much for liberty. So it's not a surprise. It's not like, oh, it's just the migrants coming into Europe, to the West and destroying the West. Like, no, it's people within the West. Most of the people who have been voting for some of these things, these socialist aspects of the government in the United States of America, were mostly Americans voting for these things. It's not just people from abroad coming in and doing that. It's not just, oh, you're just coming in and voting for policies like you have. Look at within the United States of America. They look at the California travel patterns. People leaving California, going to Arizona, going to Texas, going to Florida, people leaving New York and going to Atlanta, going to Georgia and moving to different parts, moving to Ohio, moving to the Midwest and things like this, and voting certain patterns into it. It's not necessarily just a uniquely X demographic of people. There's these people all over the place, and in the West as well, there's been people who have been for rather more authoritarian, totalitarian types of organizing society, and that still exists, and that's something that I personally I'm glad to combat, and I'm thankful for everybody else who's out there combating it in their own little way. This is something that took a lot of effort to do, and we need to continue maintaining it with effort on our part, because it takes a lot less for me to make this video than the people who actually originated some of these concepts to fight against what was going on, the major social ideas that were going on at that time. Okay. Now, the next paragraph, this is where he goes and he's talking about the civilizations in China, Japan, India, and other Mohammedan countries in the Near East, as they existed before the nations became acquainted with Western ways of life, have certainly not dismissed that as barbarism. And that's true. They had their own developments. They had their own ways of living that were rather advanced. As I mentioned, the concept of zero was one thing in South America, but some of those places had zero, but they also had mass sacrifice of cutting people's hearts out. So how did those two things combine? You can take the zero and say we don't have to have the cutting of the hearts out. So that's the kind of things I'm talking about the West. There's been some negative things in the West, but the West has also developed some really good things. So now as humans, we can say, let's take the zero from the West and leave the Western equivalent of cutting the hearts out. So I think that's something that we can do. We can look back in history and pick and share from different places. To me, appropriation is a positive thing. Cultural appropriation, because we're all humans. It's part of human culture. And life itself is appropriation. I take a fruit and I take whatever that matter is, and I take those elements, I bite it, I eat it, I digest it, and those elements become part of my human self. When you're birthed and you're in your mother's womb, you're appropriating part of the food, nutrients that they're taking in. You're taking parts that are in that person to grow you as a person. Life is appropriation, both physically and mentally and idea-wise. These languages I'm speaking, this technology, these platforms I'm using, they're not things I invented by myself, but I'm putting this out there. When I put this out there, it's out there. You can take it and listen to it and hear it and make it part of who you are and how you look at the world. It's appreciative if you send some people over here, you give a nod if I come up with something unique, or like, oh, I heard this from this person. This is kind of cool to check out. I'm completely open for that. I personally have gained so much from people being able to do that I want to just be a part of that and continue to push that on forward. But one thing that we're talking about here is one thing I was wondering, like some of the things lost in translation, there might be some actual aspects that might have come out more recently about certain cultures and things like this. But like one key thing, like with Japan, looking at it, there might have been some things, like I was saying, how Japanese is Japan today versus when Mises was writing. Mises was writing this, I don't know when he actually wrote this particular essay, but if he died in 73, so this could have been written maybe 10 years before that. But think about that's right after World War II. That's at most 30 years after World War II had ended. And at that time, you had an entire culture that thought the actual king was a god on earth, physical god, not just selected by the gods or blessed by the gods as you had in most of the Europeans with a theocracy in that kind of sense, a monarchy in that kind of sense, but no, literally a god made flesh. Kind of like how general Christians believe Jesus was God made flesh. Like that's how they thought Emperor Hirohito was. Now that's a big part. So taking some time, you still have people who were raised their entire life with that until they were adults. With, I guess not anymore, because that's the 40s, they'd be 60, they'd be dead by now. But you had people who were born when that was still a thing. Maybe, yeah, because people were still born in the 20s and things like that. Prince Philip from the United Kingdom, from England, just died, and he was born in like 29 or something. He was born like right after World War I. So, but that's still part of the culture. How long does it take for a culture to come over that? So that concept itself, if you could literally think a God, a creator of all existence was living here on earth, that person is going to is going to have different levels, a stratification of a different kind of human, different kind of being than the fellow humans. He had to step down after the two bombs were dropped. That was enough of a thing for him to say, okay, this is a massive thing. The countries had been being firebombed for some time. But he came down and he said, look, I'm not a god. We're not the selected people that are going to take over the entire world. That kind of idea was kind of taken away. So how much was that a part of Japanese society? And how much have they embraced the idea of liberty, of human freedom, of individuals being on a similar level? Because we are not all made equal. And this is one thing that I take issue with the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. The Constitution, where all men are made equal and we hold these truths to be self-evident. We're not all made equal. I'm not equal to myself, as Thomas Sowell said, as I was yesterday, as I will be tomorrow. If you're listening to this, there's hundreds of things you are probably a lot better at doing than I am. Even by simple virtue, by you being in a different location than I am, you might be better at doing that. There might be something where it's like, oh, if you push this button that's in your location, you win $1 million. I might be able to push that button faster than you if I was standing there, but by the sheer fact that you're standing there, you can push that button faster than me. So that's like a simple thing. But then we all have different things and different abilities where we're not actually all equal in that sense. But equality in front of the law can be something. But if you truly believe that someone is a god, they are above certain laws that other human beings have. But if we say we're all human beings, and if we accept to live in a certain society under these laws, we're all subject to these laws, I think that's a more equitable type of society, and that is something that is rather unique to the West. Now, the next paragraph, he makes some subjective estimations about the quality of certain life coming from the Orient. And again, this is things that might be lost in translation. And I personally am a big fan of manga and anime, and I read a lot of content from Japan, and now they're increasing to produce things from Korea and from China and in a lesser extent. And they have different storytelling. They have different structures of storytelling, and there's reasons, I think, in part of that due to the belief systems that they come from. So this is something that, for some people, they just don't like anime, but you're seeing now a transition. Some anime, some contents from that are being westernized, or some things from the West are being easternized in some sense. So now we get to the point where we're just telling human stories. And this is part of what I am thinking and advocating for, is I think we need a new form of storytelling. Because the storytellings that we were using before were people that were developing storytelling that was very unique and specific to their locations. Like you look at something like the Abrahamic religions, they were created in a rather limited scope and limited areas. So they're dealing with certain issues that were specific to the conditions on those environments that did not necessarily apply to the greater world in general. But now we have certain awareness of the entire Earth. We have a certain awareness that we're Earthlings, that we're part of a solar system. So I think we need to develop newer stories, newer ways of storytelling that can encompass just the basic things we know about society. So some of these things could be some things where there's this, if you speak different languages, this is something you understand. There's certain things where in certain languages have specific words that encompass certain emotions and certain things that can't necessarily be translated into other words. Like certain words can be said in another language that would need a paragraph of a different language in order to come close to trying to encompass and explain what that one word and inflection might mean. This is one of the reasons I prefer listening to, if I'm going to actually watch anime, I prefer listening to the dubbed versions the subbed versions, which has the text below, and the dubbed is when they change the actual voice and things. Because certain things like inflection that actually match, that are lost when you actually use other languages. So those are the kind of things that I think I added in here. And that might be a thing where he just didn't really understand certain music or certain expressions that they have. You know, when it comes to something like Beethoven's Ode to Joy, I kind of think if you actually played that and just went through some really good speaker system and put it out in some forest somewhere, I think even like the animals might stop. But I don't think that's something that you actually need to know the German language or know anything about German history in order to be somewhat moved by that. And I don't know how we would test this. Maybe go to Brazil to one of those uncontacted tribes and just try to play Beethoven's Ode to Joy to them and see what they would actually feel. Now, there could be some equivalents like that from old classical Chinese music. I don't know if there's an equivalent to those things. But one thing he does point out here is an equal thing where he says the bourgeoisie wasn't there, the middle class wasn't there in a different sense in those places where there was still an upper class, a top class that was just a lot higher than everybody else. And everybody else was just day to day and didn't have the free time and excess resources to have leisure time to actually indulge in patronizing of authors and artists and inventors. And I think that is somewhat accurate. That's something that you can just compare and you can see. You can just look at how are people spending their time, how much wealth accumulation did people have. That is something that's rather practical to see, that you can see in certain locations they happen to have middle classes, they happen to have this accumulation. There was actually an artist class in these places, artisan class, besides just being like, okay, these people are completely tied to and served by the royals. They just have to completely work for the royal houses. Like you had back in, I think even the Enlightenment times, in the classical times, you had those times of Da Vinci, there was very few people that were really at the top. Most of the people had to be attached to a family and were going around, and there was still that starving artist type of thing. It wasn't the massive thing where now you have a lot of people who are in the United States of America relatively making a living, or in the West, making a living doing things that are rather just entertainment based, rather just artistic, rather expression wise, rather subjective in actual things. People literally are making millions a year playing video games. There's people making almost millions a year, not even just playing video games, but just commenting on other people making video games. Like that's kind of something to say. That's a rather kind of, that's a positive place to be in. I think that's more positive than I think we've been for a majority of human history. And that kind of bleeds over into these last three. And they were talking about the sons of the people who in the West were actually freer. And you can see that there's a lot more invention. People talk about how much wealth is concentrated in the United States of America, but how much innovation is also concentrated in the United States of America. Now that, I think, is the tip of the spear, or whatever you want to refer to as the West, for now. So they say it's 5% of the world's population, but if you want to go by GET and think total wealth by country, it's 2019, it's 29.93% of the world's wealth, which is 105.99 trillion. Now, it also has most of the debt you have, especially with this recent pandemic and things like that. But when you talk about that, also how much innovation has come out of there? How many of the things that you use today were invented there? Other countries have the ability to take those ideas, like Japan has been excellent at that, and say, okay, this was invented somewhere else, but we're going to specialize. We're going to filter it down. We're going to siphon it down. We're going to make it very unique and get the best out of this. But the innovation, you can clearly see that there has been something about living in certain locations that has seemed to engender a lot more innovation from people. You look at a situation where a lot of people leave other places and head to the United States of America and also make their place there, make their mark on human history by inventing something after having left the location they were in. There's some people say, oh, should they just stay? And I've talked about this before, this whole brain drain idea. If you have that kind of situation, is it really a situation where, oh, these people are taking away? But if those people stay there, it's not saying like, oh, if this person moved to the United States of America and invented this widget that all of a sudden made them $10 million, that if they remained in the country that they left in, they would also still have invented that widget. So it's not directly stealing that $10 million from there. Now, that person might, in the United States of America, not invent a widget. He might just come there and just be a regular worker, but live in a situation where their children are getting a situation where they invent something much more massive. Whereas if they had actually stayed in the country of origin, they could have been more wealthy in that place, but their children wouldn't have actually been grown up in that different liberty-minded society with a different access to education, different kind of ways of thinking where they could ask certain questions and be wrong and live in different kind of ways. So, or they could have married a different person. So these considerations to kind of make, and this is why I'm thinking we should have more of a globalized kind of world, reduce some of these limitations in movement and ideas and thoughts and have this sharing and encourage that in the best way possible. And that's part of why we're looking at things like this. That's part of why I'm looking at this and saying, what is it about the West? What is it specific about this kind of society and culture that engendered so many of these positive things that I'm using, that I have benefited so much from, that chances are, if you are listening to this, you've benefited so much from. So I think that's the end for now. Thank you for listening. Shall be more of this. As I mentioned, this is a conversation series. I'm doing a lot more of the conversation series now. I will be getting to actually reading it, working up to getting myself set up so I can get into human action, which I think is going to be one of the key projects I'm going to be working on. It's probably going to take at least a couple of months once I get that up and going, a conversation series. Primarily with Stephen, might get more people into that. And that's a book by Ludwig von Mises, Human Action. You can start working on that. That's going to be a key thing because I think that is the key. Human actions are what make us who we are. The choices we make. Everything is a choice. The West was created due to the choices of people. And those choices were based off of different conditions, different environments, different options that you had available. We could have stayed here, but we weren't there. We could have done this, but we did that. So I think now we also have to think, are we still going to stay here? Or is it time to go back there? Or is it time to see what's over there? Are we still going to be still doing this, or should we give that the chance? What exactly are we doing? Why are we doing this? What are we achieving? Are these things still useful? And I think part of that is the freedom of speech, is the freedom of thought, is the freedom of sharing ideas, the freedom to be wrong without having to be punished, without having to risk your life completely just to be wrong, just to ask a question. So I hope you enjoyed this. I am not quite sure. I'm probably going to post this as one piece. I might divide it into two different pieces, but I'll probably post it as one piece. On the screen, most definitely, there would have been a speed drawing of Ludwig von Mises from my Anyone But K series, which is a thing where Che Guevara was this guy with a rather aesthetic design with the shirts that you see people wear, but I don't think most people realize who Che Guevara actually was. And I think much fewer people realize who someone like Mises is. But just with Che Guevara, I have a lot of dislike for the human being that he was, and I think there's many other people who are much more worthwhile to be on actual shirts, whether you actually know who that is, because maybe there's 100 million people, maybe not 100 million, that's kind of going with being too hyperbolic with that, but maybe there's 10,000 people see that Che Guevara shirt, and then one person decides to actually look and hear about Che Guevara, and it's oh, this is a disgusting person, I don't really like this person. But what if it's an inverse? We get this situation where there's 10,000 shirts of Ludwig von Mises out there, and then somebody sees a Mises shirt, it's oh, who is this? And they look into it, oh, wow, I've found out all these things about Ludwig von Mises. So anyway, that's the design. There's other merchandise up. More coming up on that. Also links below to other content that I have. Other ways to support me in this channel. Find other things that I've been. Taking suggestions for also other things that you think are interesting from Mises or other people that are towards liberty. Specifically, I think I'm trying to figure out what do you think the key things are that made the West the West. That made the West the current best way that humans have thought of constructing a society, the social construct of civilization. That is the best current form of it. Or if you don't think it's the best, what do you think is bad about it, and what do you think humans have done that is better? Or just ideas on what's going to come in the future. Those are things that I'm rather interested in. I hope you're interested in them too. Thank you very much for spending your time here with me, and more content coming soon. Till next time, like, share, subscribe, wherever you might be able to subscribe. Goodbye.